You know, there are some names from history that just feel bigger than life. They're less like people and more like legends, carved right into the bedrock of civilization. And one of those names, for sure, is Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. For over 3,000 years, his story has echoed down to us, a symbol of just immense power and ambition. So, okay, let's dive in and try to separate the man from the monumental myth he worked so hard to create.
For a lot of us, the whole story starts right here, with this poem, Ozymandias, right? A traveler in the desert finds this shattered, colossal statue and a boast from some long-forgotten king. It's the perfect tale about how all power fades, how all empires eventually crumble to dust. But here's the thing, that king, he wasn't forgotten at all.
This is him. This is Ozymandias. That was just the Greek name for Ramesses II. And while the poem talks about a shattered visage, this incredible bust, called the Younger Memnon, tells a totally different story. I mean, just look at that face. That's not a face of despair. It's serene, it's powerful, it's just radiating unshakable confidence. This is the man who ruled Egypt at the absolute peak of its power.
And that's the real question, isn't it? How did one pharaoh manage to carve his name so deep into history that it survived everything? The collapse of his civilization, the ruin of his statues, the shifting sands of time. Well, to figure that out, we've got to look at the two great campaigns of his life, one of war and one of stone.
Okay, so first things first, Ramesses was a warrior king. His legend wasn't just built, it was literally forged on the battlefield. Right from a young age, he was out there leading Egypt's armies, securing its borders, and expanding its influence.
And the scale of his military machine was, well, it was staggering. He reigned for 66 years. That's one of the longest reigns in all of history. He had an army of about 100,000 men at his command, and he wasn't shy about using it. In just his second year on the throne, he completely crushed this mysterious group of sea pirates called the Shurden. After that, he pushed north, leading campaign after campaign to take back territory in Canaan.
But his ultimate test, his real challenge, came from the north. It came from the only other superpower of the age, the Hittite Empire. For years, these two giants just wrestled for control of Syria. This relief here shows Ramesses in his war chariot, personally leading the charge on the Hittite fortress of Dapur. But what's really fascinating is how he decided to portray his most famous and, let's be honest, his most controversial battle.
The Battle of Kadesh. If you believe Ramesses, and he carved his version of the story on temple walls all across Egypt, it was his finest hour. He claimed his army was ambushed, and that he, almost all by himself, rallied his men and single-handedly smashed the enemy. But Hittite records tell a very, very different story. They say the Egyptian army got caught in a trap, was totally routed, and forced to retreat. So, what's the truth? Well, it was most likely a bloody stalemate. But Ramesses was an absolute master of propaganda, and he spun a near disaster into a legendary personal victory.
And that brings us right to his second great campaign. See, if he couldn't decisively crush his enemies on the battlefield, he was going to do it in granite and sandstone. He launched a building program so massive it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before.
So you've got to understand, this wasn't just about making beautiful temples. This was the state-sponsored campaign to make himself immortal. He didn't just build new stuff. He'd walk into older temples and just carve his own name right over previous pharaohs. And he ordered his artists to carve the reliefs extra deep into the stone, making them way harder for anyone else to erase, and making them pop in that harsh Egyptian sun. His name was literally everywhere.
And this right here, wow, this just shows you the sheer scale of his ambition. On the left, that's the temple at Abu Simbel, basically his ego cast in stone with 4 giant statues of himself. And on the right, those are the ruins of his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum. And that is the very place that inspired the poem Ozymandias.
And just to wrap your head around the kind of scale we're talking about, a single statue of him that once stood in the Ramesseum, which is now shattered, weighed over 1,000 tons. 1,000 tons. That's like 150 adult elephants, all carved from a single piece of granite. Just incredible.
But the story doesn't end there. Ramesses' reign has this surprising third act. After decades of war and building all this propaganda in stone, the great warrior king, well, he evolved. He became something totally new, a diplomat.
In the 21st year of his reign, after 16 more years of fighting after Kadesh, Ramesses did something absolutely unprecedented. He signed a peace treaty with his old enemies, the Hittites. This clay tablet here is a copy of that agreement, and it's the earliest known peace treaty in all of human history. It ended decades of war and kicked off a whole new era of stability.
So when you look at his timeline, you really get a sense of just how extraordinary his reign was. He takes the throne as a young man, immediately goes to war, spins the results at Kadesh, spends years building his legend in stone, and then he pivots to peace. And he ruled for so long, 66 years, that he celebrated 14 said festivals. These were these ancient jubilees meant to magically rejuvenate the pharaoh. Most pharaohs were lucky if they got to celebrate even one. He had 14. So what happens when a man who has declared himself a living god finally has to face mortality? Ramesses lived to be about 90 years old. He outlived most of his subjects, many of his wives, and even his first 12 sons. He became known to his people as the Great Ancestor.
And now, thanks to modern science, we can kind of peel back those layers of legend and see the actual man. He fathered a staggering number of kids, maybe over 100. And get this, microscopic analysis of his hair showed he was a natural redhead, which in ancient Egypt was sometimes associated with the chaotic god Set. And in his final years, the great warrior was stooped over with arthritis and was plagued by really painful dental problems.
And nothing, I mean nothing, captures his journey better than this. On the left, you've got the God King, the powerful image he projected to the world. And on the right, you have the man himself, the face of a 90-year-old who had ruled an empire for more than 2/3 of a century. The power's gone, but that presence, it's still undeniably there.
Even in death, his journey was just unbelievable. After he was buried, ancient priests had to move his body multiple times to protect it from tomb robbers. He ended up lying hidden for nearly 3,000 years, until he was rediscovered in 1881. Then, in 1976, his mummy was in such bad shape that it was flown to Paris for treatment. And when it landed, it was greeted at the airport with the full military honors you'd give a visiting head of state. Think about that for a second. 3 millennia after his death, he was still being treated like a king.
Which brings us right back where we started. Shelley's poem was actually inspired by a Greek historian's version of the inscription on one of Ramesses' statues. The original was less about despair and more of a direct challenge. It basically said, "I am the king of kings. If you want to know how great I am, go on, try and do something better than what I've done."
And in the end, his stoneworks did crumble. The Ramesseum is a ruin. His great capital city is buried under fields. But the story he told, the name he carved everywhere, the legend he built, that survived. You know, maybe the greatest work he ever created wasn't a temple or a statue at all. Maybe it was a memory so powerful that we're still sitting here talking about it 3,000 years later. Maybe that was his true victory all along.